Ever scroll through the news and feel like you're only getting like half the story? Like you
Oh,
see what's happening, but the why behind it, why things are kicking off in one place or another, it feels kind of mysterious.
yeah, I get that. It's easy to get lost in the headlines.
Exactly. So today, we're going deep, and I mean deep, into a force that shapes so much of what we see playing out on the world stage, but that we often don't even think about.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's this hidden force?
Geopolitics. Or, to put it more plainly, how the earth itself, the actual ground beneath our feet, has shaped nations and their destinies, like
Right.
since forever.
Makes sense when you put it like that.
Right. I've been digging into excerpts from this book, The Prisoners of Geography. Super fascinating stuff. And it really hit me how much geography gets missed in like our usual history lessons.
It's true.
Yeah.
We love to focus on the big personalities, the kings and queens, the generals,
Right.
but we forget about the stage they're all acting on.
Totally. It's like we think wars and treaties are just decisions made in some room, but so often those rooms, those choices, they're boxed in by mountains, split by rivers, given
Yeah.
advantages or disadvantages by coastlines.
All those things on maps we kind of gloss over.
Exactly. We don't always connect them to the bigger picture. Like one example that blew my mind, China and India.
Okay, yeah. Two of the most populous nations on Earth, going way back.
Right. They share this massive border, have for centuries, but have rarely gone to war with each other.
Hmm. You'd think it'd be the opposite with all that shared territory.
That's what I thought. But the book, it makes this point, right? The Himalayas, those mountains, they've acted as a more effective barrier than any treaty could.
Wow. So geography, in this case, is a bigger influence than politics.
It seems that way. Kept those cultures relatively separate for centuries. Imagine the resources and manpower to move an army through that kind of terrain.
Even today, with modern tech, it's a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. And it made me think geography isn't just about physical maps. It's shaping the very course of history, even the wars that don't happen.
I like that. The wars that don't happen because of a mountain range.
Right. So wild. And that brings us to, I think, a perfect example of geography's hold, Russia.
Okay, what about it? Huge country, obviously.
Right, land of, what is it, vast size, huge resources.
Powerful military.
Yeah, but as this book puts it, the prisoner of the North.
Interesting way to put it. Why is that?
Okay, so, Russia. It's twice the size of the United States or China, and yet
And yet,
it's always grappled with this strategic disadvantage. It's largely landlocked.
I see where you're going with this. Limited access to those all-important warm water ports.
Exactly, and without them,
About them.
you can't really project your power globally. You're kind of stuck.
Well, you can try other ways.
You can try, but it's tough.
It's always been Russia's Achilles heel, hasn't it? I mean, even going back to Peter the Great.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking 18th century here, and he was obsessed with getting those warm water ports.
He knew that, controlling the seas.
Yeah.
That was the key to global power. And Russia just couldn't quite get there.
Well, he tried, right? Didn't he say something like, whoever controls Constantinople in India?
Oh, he did. It's in his will, actually.
Mm.
1725. Whoever governs there, meaning Constantinople in India, will be the true sovereign of the world.
See? Geopolitics in action.
He knew what was up.
He is ahead of his time. But it shows you how deeply intertwined geography and ambition are throughout Russia's history. I mean, they're still trying to get those warm water ports.
I mean, can you blame him? Without those ports, without easy access to the world's oceans, it's tough to compete on a global scale. Limits your trade, limits your military options.
Makes you understand their actions in Crimea a little better, doesn't it?
Crimea, 2014, right?
Yeah, when Russia annexed it, a lot of people, they saw it as Putin just trying to flex his muscles, relive the glory days of the Soviet Union.
Right, right. Nostalgia for a bygone era, some folks said.
Exactly. But it wasn't just that. Control of Crimea, it gave Russia's Black Sea Fleet a clear path to the Mediterranean.
Which means,
They could project power far beyond their own borders. Classic geopolitics, wouldn't you say?
textbook case. And it makes you wonder, what about other major players? China, for example. They're everywhere these days.
Ah, China. Now, there's a country that's been making some serious geopolitical moves, but even they've got their limitations. Our source points out some serious ones, actually, when it comes to geography.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because on the surface, they seem pretty well positioned.
Right. You'd think so. Huge coastline.
Booming economy.
Yep. But they're hemmed in. The Gobi Desert to the north,
Right.
the Tibetan Plateau to the west.
Starting to see the picture.
And of course, we can't forget about those Himalayas looming large on their southwestern border.
Right, right. Always those mountains, always playing a role. It's fascinating, isn't it, how these geographical features have shaped not just China's borders, but their whole story.
Totally. I mean, think about it. Population, agriculture, it's all concentrated in the East, largely because of those natural barriers we were just talking about.
It's a constant balancing act for them,
Yeah.
managing relationships with powerful neighbors within a landscape that doesn't always make things easy.
Right. It's like they're playing a constant game of geopolitical Tetris. But here's the thing, they're also tackling those challenges head on, like full force.
Oh, absolutely. They're not shying away from a challenge.
Building those island bases in the South China Sea, pouring resources into that new railroad into Tibet. It's almost like they're trying to engineer their way out of these natural constraints.
It's an interesting strategy, right? And on a scale that's almost hard to comprehend, China is definitely showing the world they're willing to challenge geographic limitations through sheer willpower and, of course, a whole lot of investment.
Exactly. I mean, it makes you wonder what they'll accomplish in the next decade or two. Talk about a force to be reckoned with.
Indeed. Now, shifting gears a bit to another global power, let's consider the United States.
Okay, the U.S.
Yeah, the book refers to it as a fortress built on concrete. And I think it's a really apt description because it's not just about the oceans that separate them from potential adversaries.
Right, right. Okay, so what else makes the U.S. so geographically secure, would you say, besides the obvious, like being a giant landmass with big oceans on either side?
Well, think about it. Vast oceans to the east and west, sure, but also friendly neighbors to the north and south. And no major powers directly on its borders.
True. No historical rivalries playing out over, like, easily crossed borders or anything.
Exactly. From the very beginning, the U.S. has had this inherent security advantage, allowed them to rise to global power without facing the same kind of existential threats as, say, a Russia or a China.
It's true. No one was trying to invade them via the Rocky Mountains, you know what I mean?
Exactly. And that has undoubtedly influenced their worldview, wouldn't you say?
100%. But they haven't just rested on their laurels, so to speak. I mean, they've definitely capitalized on that geographic good fortune.
Oh, absolutely they have. The U.S.'s rise is, in many ways, a story of strategic expansion. Securing control of key waterways, think the Panama Canal, building this incredible network of military bases that literally span the globe.
I love how the book puts it. Hold on. I wrote it down. Okay, here it is. It says, "It has always been for all nations until now a tale of concrete. Concrete to build harbors, runways, fortified aircraft hangars, fuel depots, dry docks, and barracks."
And that concrete, it represents more than just physical infrastructure. It represents influence, the ability to project power and respond to events anywhere in the world, and to do it rapidly.
It's true. It's not just about having a big stick. It's about being able to bring it places. And that global reach, that logistical network, it's a huge part of what makes the U.S. a superpower, wouldn't you say? Not just military might, but that ability to...
To go anywhere, do anything, anytime.
Exactly.
It's a point that often gets overlooked in discussions about American power.
Totally. Okay, so the U.S., geographically speaking, kind of seems like they drew the lucky hand, right? But then you have Europe.
Ah, Europe. Now there's a place where geography has truly played a starring role, both the triumphs and the tragedy.
Right, because for centuries, I mean, Europe was the world power. Like, it wasn't even a question.
And for good reason. They've got those fertile plains, those incredible navigable rivers that crisscross the whole continent, not to mention a relatively temperate climate, all things considered.
Right, all those things. They contributed to their historical dominance, for sure.
Facilitated trade, exchange of ideas, helped spark the Industrial Revolution even. But here's the thing.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Well, in geopolitics, there often is. All those rivers, those open plains, made it pretty easy to, well, invade your neighbor.
And invade they did. For centuries, right? It's like a never-ending game of risk over there.
Right. And all those invasions, those constantly shifting alliances, the territorial disputes that define so much of European history, they left their mark. Particularly, I would argue, between France and Germany.
Oh, tell me about it. You can't talk about European history without talking about that rivalry. What was it our source said? Something about instinct and old fears.
Ah, yes. The book says, and I'm quoting here, by instinct, the Germans know that if the EU fragments, old fears about Germany will resurface, particularly now that it is Europe's most populous and wealthiest nation.
So even with the EU, even with all the progress they've made, there's still this underlying tension, this sense that history could repeat itself.
There, for sure, like a shadow lurking in the background. And geography has placed these two nations in a constant state of tension, destined to be both partners and rivals, their fates intertwined by proximity and a shared history that's, well, let's just say it's complicated.
Talk about a complex relationship. And this is where the whole European Union thing comes in, right? Because honestly, given all that history, all that baggage, it's an incredibly ambitious undertaking.
It is. I mean, you're talking about trying to transcend centuries of, let's call it geopolitical drama, to create a new kind of power structure, one based on cooperation and shared prosperity rather than, who conquered who last.
Right. Talk about an uphill battle. So the question is, can it work?
Can the EU, with all its noble goals, truly overcome the weight of history, the pull of geography? It's a question that only time can answer. But it's certainly an experiment worth watching, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And while Europe's off trying to build this new kind of future, it feels like Africa is still, in a lot of ways, grappling with a past that was also heavily shaped by geography, just in different ways.
Ah, Africa. A continent of incredible diversity, both in its cultures and its geography. And that presents both incredible opportunities and, let's be honest, significant challenges.
And when we're talking challenges in Africa, we can't not talk about the Sahara Desert.
I mean, it's right there on the map. Hard to miss.
Exactly. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more formidable geographical barrier, wouldn't you say? I mean, the Sahara has been shaping the course of human history for millennia.
Absolutely. It's been a barrier to development and, unfortunately, a driver of conflict for centuries. But it's not the only challenge facing the continent.
Right, because there's also the whole legacy of colonialism to contend with.
Ah, yes. Can't forget about that. The arbitrarily drawn borders, often ignoring existing ethnic and cultural divisions.
It's like they just took a ruler and drew lines on a map without any regard for what was happening on the ground.
Sadly, that's pretty much what happened in a lot of cases. And those arbitrary borders, they've had a lasting impact, that's for sure, contributing to conflict and instability in many parts of the continent.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is a prime example of that, right?
The DRC, unfortunately, is often cited as the textbook case of what's called the resource curse.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term before, but can you refresh my memory? What does it actually mean?
Basically, it's this. The DRC has these massive deposits of natural resources, right? We're talking diamonds, gold, cobalt, you name it, they've probably got it.
Right, it should be like the wealthiest place on Earth.
Exactly. But instead of being a source of prosperity, those riches often end up fueling conflict and corruption.
It's like that saying, too much of a good thing, but in this case, it's tragic.
Right. It's heartbreaking. And the DRC illustrates that perfectly, unfortunately. The lack of infrastructure, the arbitrary borders we talked about, and then you toss in these incredibly valuable resources. It creates a perfect storm for internal strife and external meddling, frankly.
It's like everyone wants a piece of the pie, but no one's really looking out for the people who actually live there.
It's a complex situation for sure. And a stark reminder of how geography and history can intersect to create these seemingly intractable problems.
It can feel really disheartening, to be honest. Like, are there any bright spots, any signs of hope for the continent?
I'm glad you asked that. Because it's important to remember that Africa is not a monolith, right? It's a continent of 54 countries, each with its own unique story. And there are absolutely inspiring stories of progress and innovation emerging across the continent, despite the challenges.
Oh, good. Give me some good news. What kind of progress are we talking about?
Well, for one, we're seeing significant investment in infrastructure. Think things like that new Chinese-built railroad in Kenya connecting it to the region. Trade is expanding, creating new economic opportunities, and there's this whole new generation of entrepreneurs and activists who are working tirelessly to build a brighter future for Africa,
I love to hear that. It's like they're taking their destiny into their own hands.
Exactly. And that spirit of agency, that determination to chart their own course, it's not limited to Africa. We see it in many parts of the world, even as we face these new, very 21st century challenges.
Or climate change, for example.
Exactly. Climate change, it's the ultimate curveball. And one of the places we're seeing its impact most dramatically is in the Arctic.
The Arctic. That's interesting. It's not a region that immediately springs to mind when we talk about, like, global hotspots.
Right. It's often overlooked. But it's rapidly becoming a focal point for, well, let's just call it what it is, global competition.
Okay, so what's happening in the Arctic?
Now think about it. The ice is melting, right? Which, on the one hand, is terrifying and a sign of how much we've messed up the planet.
Yeah.
But from a purely geopolitical perspective,
Yes.
it means new shipping routes are opening up. And maybe more importantly, vast reserves of oil and natural gas are becoming accessible.
It's like a whole new frontier is opening up at the top of the world.
Exactly. And that raises the multi-trillion-dollar question. Who gets to control it?
Because everyone's going to want a piece of that action.
Oh, 100%.
Uh,
And Russia, they're not being shy about it. With that massive Arctic coastline and their fleet of icebreakers, they're already making some very assertive moves to, well, let's just say it, establish dominance.
which makes sense when you think about it. I mean, we just talked about how Russia's always been searching for those warm water ports.
Right, warm water, or
Sure.
maybe just less frozen water.
Exactly. And suddenly they're in a prime position to control these newly ice-free sea lanes, right?
It's a fascinating twist. But it's not just Russia that's paying attention. Other countries with Arctic claims, Canada, the US, Norway, Denmark, they're all watching this very closely, you can be sure.
So it's like all these competing interests, all this historical baggage, converging on a region that's literally being reshaped by climate change. Talk about a recipe for, well, tension, at the very least.
At the very least, it really highlights that complex interplay between geography, resources, and international relations that we've been talking about. And it's playing out right now, in real time, at the top of the world.
And here's a fun little wrinkle. I was reading that the U.S., they never actually ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Oh, that's right. They didn't, did they? Which puts them at a bit of a disadvantage, legally speaking, when it comes to making claims to resources in the Arctic.
Exactly. So even as we try to address this global challenge, climate change, it just creates new geopolitical dilemmas.
It seems to be a recurring theme throughout history, doesn't it? Solve one problem, create 10 more.
Tell me about it. And speaking of recurring themes, our source, they even touch on space as a potential battleground for resources and strategic advantage. This is wild to think about. Is this the next frontier in geopolitics, would you say?
It sounds like science fiction, right? But if we're being honest with ourselves, the competition for resources, that drive for strategic advantage, it's already extending beyond Earth's atmosphere.
So what you're saying is all those patterns we see here on Earth, the competition, the jockeying for position, even the conflict, we're just going to replicate them in space.
It's certainly something to consider, because it speaks to this fundamental truth, the enduring power of geography, even, or maybe especially, as we venture beyond our own planet.
It really makes you wonder, are we hardwired for this kind of competition? Are we destined to repeat these patterns wherever we go?
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But I believe that by understanding those patterns, by recognizing how they've influenced our past and continue to shape our present, we can, at the very least, make more conscious choices about how we engage with the world around us, both here on Earth and beyond.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of geopolitics, what's the key takeaway for our listener? What should they be keeping in mind as they, navigate this increasingly complex world?
The biggest lesson I hope they take away is this. Never underestimate the power of geography. It shapes our history, our politics, our economies, even our very identities. Understanding those influences, it can be incredibly empowering.
It's like you're saying geography is more than just maps and capitals, right? It's the foundation on which everything else is built.
Beautifully put. Once you start to see the world through that lens,
Yeah.
well, let's just say it can be pretty eye-opening.
It's like we've been given this amazing new superpowered geopolitical X-ray vision. We can see the world with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And that's a powerful tool to have, wouldn't you say? Especially in times like these.
100%. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we sign off?
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never, ever underestimate the power of place in shaping the human story.
I love it. That's a wrap on today's deep dive into the world of geopolitics. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.